As I said earlier, there's more reason to have minimum qualifications for a sealed bid procurement than there is for a sealed proposal procurement, because there is no evaluation in a sealed bid procurement. There is some minimal evaluation in multi-step, but it's not evaluation as most people consider it. And the other aspect, of course, of sealed bidding is the award must go to the lowest price vendor, even if that vendor is only 1 cent less than another vendor. So you cannot say, well, it's 1 cent less, but the other vendor has much more qualifications, so I'm going to give it to the other vendor that's only 1 cent more, that has more qualifications. Can't do that. The only way that you can go beyond the low bidder is you must eliminate them as either being not responsible or their bid being non-responsive. If you do not eliminate them, you must go to the lowest bidder. And if you eliminate them, you must have a basis. Responsive, we discussed that in Procure class. Their bid has to be compliant with the specifications, so the bid's comparable to everybody else. And responsible, they must be capable of doing the work. And they must have reliability, that you believe they're going to do the work. If they don't, bid price doesn't matter. But you must eliminate them. You cannot go and just say, well, I still don't want to pick them. If it's sealed bidding, that's what you have to do. So there's more reason to have set this threshold, this line in the sand. Often the speed of an award has great emphasis, while issues of responsibility can be determined after the date of bid opening, and that's something you need to keep in mind. We discussed in Procure. Responsiveness is determined from the bid document itself. It is determined solely on what has been submitted by the vendor. And that's responsiveness. And responsiveness only applies to a sealed bid procurement. Responsibility applies to both sealed bidding and sealed proposal, because you have a vendor in both instances. And if it's an issue of capability, reliability, or integrity of the vendor, that can be determined after the bid or proposal submission date. So a lot of people think, I can't go back and talk to a vendor if I did a sealed bid procurement, so I need to eliminate them if I don't know that they are clearly responsible. And they typically, a lot of people use the word responsive for everything. That is one size fits all. They're non-responsive. And it isn't one size fits all. It only pertains to a bid price. So if you're looking at whether a vendor can do something, that's an issue of responsibility, and issues of responsibility can be determined after the bid due date. And basically, you're required to go back and try to satisfy issues of responsibility. And when you look at references, references don't impact a bid price. They didn't give a bid price because they had 5 references. 5 references supposedly indicate they're capable of doing the work. Ergo, it's an issue of responsibility that even if you told them, give me 5 references, and they didn't, and your initial reaction is to find them non-responsive because they didn't do what you told them to do. Their decisions, multiple decisions of the Board of Contract Appeals has said very specifically, issues of responsibility cannot be made into issues of responsiveness by the terms of the solicitation, i.e., merely saying you have to identify 5 references does not mean that those 5 references are now issues of responsiveness that have to be there with the bid. They are issues of capability. They forever will be issues of capability. And so since they are issues of capability, which means responsibility, if they don't give it to you, just by telling them to give it to you, you have to go back and say, give it to me. Give me 5 references, if that's what you required, and you can put a time frame. You have 2 days to give me those references. And if they don't meet the time frame, not the time frame that said the bid due date, but the time frame that you gave them when you went back to them, you will find them not responsible, not non-responsive, not responsible for failing to comply with requirements within a reasonable time frame. But you have to know the distinction between responsive and responsible to know what you're dealing with. Responsibility, after the fact, you can go get it. Yes.
One quick clarification. If you know the contractor is marginal with respect to performance because of past work,
Okay.
you go out for bid and they come back as the low bidder.
Mm-hmm.
Can I then, as a part of responsible, say to them that their poor performance in the past disqualifies them for consideration?
His question is, if you've dealt with a vendor before, they have gotten contracts from you, and you know that you have had problems with them in the past, can you use that to find them, regardless of their bid price, to find them not responsible? And the answer is yes, you can. Now you have to be very comfortable, and your attorney needs to be very comfortable that you have a good rationale for that. So for instance, you need to go back and for the prior instances where you said they didn't do a good job, were they notified they didn't do a good job? Do you have things in writing that says that you told them you are not doing this, you're not doing the other thing? Or when it gets pushed to shove, will they come back and if they're told they're not responsible, they'll say, what are you talking about? What do you mean you weren't satisfied with my prior work? First, I've heard of it. And if you haven't told them before, and if they appeal it, they file a protest, they may win.
As long as you've got emails that indicated that they've been encouraged to do this and do that and do this.
And it depends on, you can send an email and still the email can be faulty as far as what it says. Because maybe you're accusing them of doing things and they have a rebuttal, and because you didn't make an issue of it at that time, it never really got resolved. And if you use that in the future, maybe it now will become an issue. So that's the kind of thing, before I find a vendor not responsible, I go to my lawyer, I lay out all the circumstances, and I say, okay, how comfortable will you be defending this? And I'll tell you that the other thing that comes into play is picking your battles. And sometimes you'll decide if the vendor is typically, well, by that time, if they're not low bidder, it doesn't matter. If it's a sealed bid and you've opened the price, you don't even worry about, other than low bidder, whether they're responsive, responsible, anything else. They're not going to win, period. The only way they're going to win is if you eliminate the low bidder for some other reason, and now they're the one that's next in line. Then you have to deal with that issue. So, answer the question?
Yes, sir.
All right. Let's see. So you have to take low bidder. Speed of award has great emphasis. Can be determined after award. Oftentimes in a sealed bid, you don't want to take the time, even though you have the ability and in fact the obligation to try to determine issues of responsibility after you open the bid. You don't want to take the time to do it, to give them another 2 or 3 days, for instance, and so you may establish a minimum qualification and have that be the threshold of whether they're determined to be responsible or not responsible. So the solution for a sealed bid, and I keep emphasizing sealed bid, is you may want to set minimum qualifications. And if established correctly, and we will go through another 10 or 15 slides about considerations, minimum bidder requirements usually allow an immediate determination of whether the lowest bidder is responsible, i.e. if they meet these requirements, they are responsible, unless you know something else that indicates otherwise, and if they don't meet the requirements, they're not responsible. Something that is a fundamental issue that I will say now and forevermore, and some of you have heard this from me before, a minimum qualification should not involve any evaluation of whether the vendor meets that minimum qualification. It must be an objective standard that anybody who looks at that standard and looks at what the vendor has provided can tell the same thing, yes, the vendor did meet the standard, or no, the vendor did not meet the standard. It doesn't have to be something that you give to an evaluation committee for them to try to decide whether the vendor met a minimum requirement. If you have to do an evaluation, it's not a minimum requirement. It's an evaluated factor. And I will give you some illustration about what I mean by objective. First of all, if you believe that you have to do some kind of evaluation to determine if a vendor qualifies, then you don't make that a minimum qualification. That's an evaluation factor. So if you think you have to do evaluation, don't use a sealed bid. Since sealed bid doesn't allow you to do evaluation, don't use a procurement method that doesn't allow you to do an evaluation if you think you need to evaluate. Either do multi-step or do sealed proposals. And that is more advisable to change the procurement method than just say, okay, I'm going to make it $500,000 minimum requirement, and anybody who meets that, I'll be okay with. If you're doing a $50,000 procurement, $500,000 is way restrictive for a minimum requirement. So don't just set overly restrictive minimum requirements. If necessary, change the procurement method or do other things. Ideal characteristics, as we just said, should not require evaluation. Should be written so that it is obvious, objectively determinable if they have been met. Only the procurement officer will be involved in making a determination as to whether minimum qualifications have been met. Since it is not an evaluation factor, you don't have to have any group of people, whether they're called an evaluation committee or something else, look at it to make a decision, because the procurement officer should be able to tell whether an objective standard is or isn't met. And the procurement officer is the one whose job it is to make that determination. And so the procurement officer is the one who will review the minimum qualifications and make the determination. And if the determination is the minimum qualifications as objectively identified have not been met, the vendor will be eliminated by the procurement officer and it will never go to an evaluation committee. Waivers should not be considered. I said that already. The requirements should be absolutes. If the requirement isn't met, the vendor is eliminated. You will not have wording in your solicitation that says you reserve the right to waive a minimum requirement. If you do, and if I see it, it'll be stricken. If one of my people see it, it'll be stricken. Shouldn't be there. That's what minimum means, minimum. And if you want the ability to decide, you're really saying you want the ability to evaluate. So either decide, what do you want more? The ability to evaluate. If you do, multi-step or sealed bidding. I'll live with sealed bid, then just have the minimum and that's it. Yes?
We have done amendments though where we've taken out, when we get complaints from vendors, we've taken them out.
Yeah. If vendors have problems with your requirements, they should let you know, and then you make the decision, will you stay with what you have, or will you reduce it, revise it, something else? And lots of times, we will revise minimum requirements. There are times when we set them up, we think that anybody, it won't be difficult to meet, and then someone can come in and say, well, the way you've worded it specifically makes it difficult. Would you change it to something else? And if it doesn't make a lot of difference to us, we just change it.
I'd like to just call a distinction between doing an amendment before a due date and evaluating what is sent to you after the due date. You can make all the changes before the due date that you deem are necessary as a result of vendor discussions or whatever other means. Once you have them, you're not in a position to change the minimum qualifications. So for example, if you require 3 years experience and the guy comes and says, I have 2 years, 11 months, that's no good, because there may have, it's an issue of fairness. There may be other people out there who have just under 3 years of experience that read the rules, did not bid, and eliminated themselves. And now you're going to accept somebody, so it's an issue of fairness.
You'd have to go all back out and
That's right.
do the whole bunch.
Gary is absolutely correct. I didn't say that. But again, you go back and make the distinction between procurement methods. Obviously, what Gary's talking about is sealed proposals, because with a sealed bid, you cannot change specifications after the bids are received. Cannot, period. So The only method that allows you to make a change after receipt is sealed proposals, and that is one thing you should not change, because what that means is you want to make a change, obviously, to permit someone who has already responded to stay in the running. That's the only reason to make such a change, that you open someone's proposal and they say, I know you said 3 years, we have 2 years, 11 months, we thought it was close enough that you would say we're okay, so we submit it anyway. And if you say yes, as Gary said, you don't know how many other vendors took that as a rigid requirement and believed you when you said 3 years is the minimum and didn't submit. And if they found out later that you waived that requirement, they could file a bid protest and they would win.
And rightfully so.
Yes. So, no waivers. Mean what you say what you mean. Let's see, it should be readily apparent how the requirement relates to what is being procured. You don't set a requirement seemingly to be arbitrary. Well, I know that the vendor I want makes green bird baths, and so I'm going to set a minimum requirement for a food service company that the vendor has to have made 500 green bird baths. Has no relevance whatsoever to the contract, the procurement at hand. That's obviously a very extreme example, and I had difficulty thinking of something that stupid. But that's hopefully illustrates it needs to be obvious how the one requirement relates to what you are procuring. Another thing that I will say over and over, not just here, but in the next 10 or so slides, this next thing. It is not necessary, and actually it is suggested that you do not establish the exact level of activity as required under the procurement. If I expect a bid to come in at $100,000, don't require a $100,000 reference to do a $100,000 contract, because that it doesn't have to be one-to-one. And I'll go through other slides and explain more on that. The level of what is being required needs to be appropriate but not excessive. Frequently requiring the exact same level could be viewed as being unnecessarily restrictive, and if it's unnecessarily restrictive, you will lose if it is determined by the Board of Contract Appeals it's unreasonably restrictive. And one thing that DBM is specifically in Title 21 required to do, in fact, control agencies, so it'd be DBM, DGS, and DO IT, are required to review specifications to avoid unreasonably restrictive specifications. So our job is to keep you from having unreasonably restrictive specifications. That's our job, and we do it well. Just say no, you can't have anything. All right, that's another type of joke that was supposed to be funny. Don't you love it when I have to tell you when I tell a joke? That tells you why I'm not a stand-up comedian. Let's see, you want to know that a vendor has some, I want to emphasize, some experience. That it isn't as if they've never done this before, period. You aren't going to be the test tube for them to learn to see if they can do something. But there's a difference between the exact same level and, yes, they've done it before, but just not to the same level you're asking for now. So you want some experience generally, but not necessarily exact. Requirements should not be set so high that new vendors can never compete for an award. This has, as I said before, the harshest impact on small minority vendors. Businesses can never grow if they're never permitted to do something bigger than they've done before, or that it has to be exactly like the state's requirements, because we say this all the time. We want similar experience. And the first thing I say is define what similar is. And once you define it, then get rid of the word similar and just use what you've just defined. Particularly with government, there are many things that the only vendor that's going to have similar experience is a vendor that's done work for another government, which sometimes there is no other government that's done it. Sometimes there's only one or two, so that might be very restrictive just to say it must be similar in every aspect. So you need to look at what do you mean by similar? Do you simply mean a dollar value? Do you mean the number of references? What do you mean define similar? I say that over and over and over. Don't just use a word that is ambiguous in and of itself. Conversely, you don't want vendors to have total on-the-job training, whereby they learn how to do your contract by doing your contract, which means there could be a steep learning curve and may mean you will not get full value of payments made in the early stages. You may be paying, you theoretically are paying the same amount of money from the first day to the last day, but if you're getting less than what is expected in the first day because they don't know what they're doing, then you're paying for service you're not getting. And you're taking the risk that they will overcome that learning curve and learn how to do the job properly before it's over. So it's a risk if you don't have a minimum threshold. So I keep telling you, there's pluses, there's minuses, there's things to consider. As I said, a vendor may never fully learn how to perform. There may be continual performance problems. You may end up defaulting them. You may terminate for convenience because you don't want to do a default, etc., because they never got up to speed. You took the risk and the risk didn't pan out. Talked about this, the dilemma of going and get hired, etc. And high minimum requirements may unnecessarily cost the state money. Vendors know their competitors. So if you have a high requirement for vendors to respond, they're going to be able to look around to their competitors and know who of their competitors can meet that. And if they know there's 10 competitors in the marketplace, but they know that only they and like 2 others can meet that minimum requirement, they immediately know that 7 are out of the running. So it's down to me and you 2. And I know that you have a whole bunch of other contracts, and I've talked to my friend who works for you, and I said, what do you think about that state contract? You going to go after that? Oh, no, we're too busy. We're not going to do that. So I know, well, you're out of the running. It's just me and you. And maybe I know what you're doing. I know you're full up. And maybe I know you're not going to bid. I'm the only bidder. Sometimes that happens. Just by the minimum qualifications, they can determine who can respond. And if they feel that that basically puts them in the driver's seat, then how much do I want to charge for this? I don't have to sharpen my pencil to use the terminology, because you're going to come to me and you're going to award to me because I'm going to be the only game in town. And you've done it with your specifications. So you have to consider that. Let's see, anticipate other times, maybe they won't be interested. As we said again, harshest impact, small minority and often resident vendors. These are the firms usually with the least amount of experience in terms of number of and types of accounts, duration, and value. They have fewer. They've had them typically for less period of time. They've typically been for less value, and so they are very often precluded from even trying to compete by high minimum requirements. And since these are the types of firms that the state is trying to encourage by having things like the MBE program, the small business preference, the small business reserve, reciprocal preference, we do all these things to try to encourage resident small and minority vendors to win, so we don't want to pull the rug out from under them by saying, nope, you can't even bid because you don't meet the minimum requirements. You have to consider these. Considering all the above discussed factors, the recommended requirements, so here we go. These are the recommendations as per Joel. This is what I will say. Usually, you should not have a minimum requirement that exceeds 50% of the contract value. Usually. I'm not saying you never can, but beyond this, you will want to have some really good justification, i.e., we've only got one shot. And if this doesn't work, there's going to be this pandemic, flu epidemic, and the results will be catastrophic, so we have to have someone that has done this exact thing before. We can't trust anybody else. Well, if civilizations we know is going to be exterminated if a vendor doesn't perform, yes, we will let you have the same dollar value. But if it is no dire consequence of that nature, 50% is generally the highest that we will allow you to specify. Can be as low as 10%, and the thing that I say that is the most, probably the most reasonable, is in the 20 to 25% range as a minimum qualification. Now that's a threshold, and I'll tell you in the next slide. Considering all the above discussed material, the recommended required prior experience duration, because you're looking at different characteristics of references. The one is dollar value. That is one characteristic. Second characteristic is how long the vendor has done contracts of this nature. And so generally the longest that we will allow is 5 years as a minimum requirement. I've seen them for 10 years. You have to have done this for 10 years. Why? A lot of you haven't done your own job for 10 years. Does that mean you can't do it? Nope, you can't do your job if you haven't done it for 10 years, so you're out of here. It just, 5 is the maximum that we will allow in typical circumstances. Can be as low as 1 year. If all you want to know is the vendor has done it before, you may be able to get that information from just the fact the vendor has done it for as little as 1 year. They're in this marketplace. They do this type of work. But generally, if you look at a rule of thumb, maybe 2 to 3 years is a good rule of thumb for duration. For sealed bid procurements, since we said you generally want to have more rigidity for sealed bids, you might go on the higher side of what I just said. You may go for the dollar value be 20 to 50%, and you may want the experience be to 3 to 5, because you're being some safeguards. For sealed proposals, you probably want to go on the low side, 10 to 20%, 1 to 3 as minimums, or the one I generally like to see is none, since you don't have to set any minimums. But if you do set a minimum, very minimal, just to show they have some capability. The most typical minimum requirement is a minimum number and value of references. 3 references of at least $500,000 each. Usually the requirement is for the reference to be this nebulous situation of similar size and complexity. What is similar size and complexity? Well, how does a vendor know what is similar size? How does a vendor know what is similar complexity? So you have to define it, and you'll put numbers to that. Which brings up the issue of similar. When we had the 2 people and said, are they similar? Well, you don't know if they're similar. Someone else is going to have to tell you what this criteria are to judge similar, and we say tell them in the solicitation what similar is. Absolutes should mean what they mean, say what they mean. Absolute in terms of the dollar value, number of units, etc. of references. Which means there is no confidence that a vendor without the level of reference will be able to perform the contract. So that's what putting a minimum reference means. That you're saying that if you don't have this, I don't believe you can do the work. So you need to keep it in that context. That's what you're saying, and if you don't mean it, don't say it. Set it lower, don't set it at all. Before setting references, it needs to be determined if there is or is not an acceptable learning curve for what is being procured, i.e. if the contractor must perform at full performance level from day 1 of the contract. For many state activities, those involving the public, clients, etc., you do have that. The vendor must have consistent, uniform performance from day 1 to the last day of the contract, and you don't have a learning curve. Some examples. Excuse me, will be on the next slide, I guess. If any learning curve is unacceptable, reference levels might be set higher than otherwise. If some learning curve is acceptable, reference levels might be set lower than otherwise. So these are all considerations for whether you should do it or not do it. So here's some examples. If you had food service at a state facility, obviously, well, you really don't have to feed the patients on the first day, or it doesn't matter if you have a little bit of E. coli bacteria the first day. As long as by the 7th or 10th day, you're no longer poisoning them, that's okay, right? You have to perform from the first day. If you're doing something to serve the public, if they're going to, let's say, outsource driver's licenses, well, you don't want all the people that come in on the first day, not that that's going to happen, but you don't want all the public that comes into the vendor on the first day for the vendor and all their people to not know what to do, and you just have people waiting around the whole day, not getting served, and told come back tomorrow, and when they come back tomorrow, then it's basically the same as the first day because they're learning what to do. If that's the situation, it may make a lot of sense to have minimum qualifications as long as they are not too high. If you're running commuter bus, yep, you need the commuter bus to run the first day, the second day, the third day to get where it's supposed to go at the time it's supposed to go, etc. And presumably you're paying for the same level of service, so you want to make sure you get the same level of service. So if that's what you have, you may have minimum qualification. If it's something that is not that critical, you have to give them a report. And let's say it's a fixed price for the report, and we give you 3 months to do it. The vendor taking 2 weeks of startup time has no impact on the price, the performance, just as long as within 3 weeks, 3 months, whatever I said, they give you the report's done well for the price they specified. If they have to learn on the job to do it, so what? As long as learning on the job is not so much that it calls into question what they gave you as the recommendation. So discrete projects without time urgency might be things where you have little or no minimum qualifications. Let's see. Also, if a vendor is judged to be a quality vendor but lacks experience in the subject of the contract, a minimum generic experience level might be okay. We're going to talk about these type of things. Is that the next slide? Yes, it is. When you're talking about minimum level of references, these are the things you must identify. The type of experience, and in terms of, can it be general, can it be food service, or must it be specific? Food service to a medically fragile population with services of a clinical dietitian to determine special diets, etc. Can you have operated a cafeteria for a business versus you must have operated a hospital cafeteria providing food to patients in a hospital setting? One is generic experience providing food, one is very specific experience providing food in a medical environment because there are particular requirements for people in a medical environment. They have special diets, etc. So one is generic experience, one is specific experience. What are you requiring? Are you requiring generic and not specific? Do you have a combination of both generic and specific? You need to focus on both issues. Minimum number of references. And minimum number can take one or more, well, typically we'll take at least several of these. Dollar amount and duration. Those two things that we keep saying over and over. Sometimes it's not quite so nice. It depends on what you're buying. Sometimes it's hours of effort, that you must have had at least 20,000 hours of auditing service, because the issue is how many hours of service you provided, not how long it took to do it or something like that. Or the number of clients served, things of that nature. That might be the threshold. But something that's objective. The time frame within which the requirement must have been satisfied, and this is something that frequently is not there. You must have had 3 references of, even if you go along, $5,000 each. Well, yeah, 20 years ago, I had one 20 years ago, I had one 18 years ago, and one 15 years ago. Do you think that's a pretty good reference? Well, have you done anything in the past 15 years? Well, no, not in that subject matter. But I have 3 references that I've done in what you've required. I meet your minimum requirements. But it isn't what you want, because you want to know if they're doing it now. So you want them to be current, you have to say what current is. Current means within the last 3 years, within the last 5 years, etc. So you have to give that standard. Whether a currently being performed contract can be used as a reference. If it's a 3-year contract and they've done 2 years of it, can they count that as a reference? And lots of times, 2 years of a 3-year contract that's millions of dollars will be a more valid reference than 2 or 3 completed references of $100,000 each. These are examples how you can have these things which seemingly are very objective, but when you get down to it, you have vendors that can do other things just as well or better that might not meet your preconceived notion of what you wanted. So you might have say, yes, you can count a currently being performed contract as long as it's been performed for at least 6 months, and in those 6 months has met the dollar threshold specified, etc. For the reference, these are other things for you to consider. Whether the reference can be counted if the people who worked for your company, who did the work, are no longer with your company. I.e., is it generic reference that is good enough for the company to just have performed it, or do you want the specific people who did that work? And if you want the people, then you need to say that. We need the company to have this amount of references, but you must identify the employees of the company who worked on that project, and those employees must be identified in your proposal as being offered to work on this project. Don't give us people that don't have experience, even if the company overall has experience. So that's something you might specify. If the vendor competing for an award does not satisfy a reference requirement itself, can it hire people that have the experience? Well, no, I have not done 3 accounts in the last 5 years, but hey, I can go out and in 2 weeks I can hire people that have done lots and lots of projects. So is that good enough? You need to say in your specifications whether that's allowable. And there's some circumstances where it may be and some circumstances where it may not be. If there's another one that does come into play, if you have people that have loads of experience, years and years of experience, and they go out and start their own company, and they started their company 6 months ago, and you require 3 references, and they haven't been in business long enough to have 3 references, can they count their own personal experience? You need to say one way or the other, because in that particular instance, if you don't, the default rule, and this is by the Board of Contract Appeals, is the general rule is that if a solicitation is silent on whether the experience of owners or key personnel can be counted as satisfying a reference requirement, then such experience can be counted. So if you have not said that it must be the company, and it's not good enough for individuals with the experience to be offered instead of the company, it can't be counted. If you have not said that, and the vendor comes in and says, well, you and I are partners in this new venture. I have 20 years, you have 25 years. We have 45 years of experience, even though we started our company 2 months ago, and you have not said that isn't good enough, and you preclude us, and we appeal, we protest and appeal, etc., we're going to win. Because that has been the decisions of the Board of Contract Appeals. So you have to say that. If it is intended that only the experience of the prime vendor can be considered, the solicitation must say this. Sometimes it isn't. We don't care if you have people that have done the work that you have hired, even if you hired them 6 months ago, that we want to know you as a company have the resources up and down the line, vertically integrated to do the work. So we want the company to have the resources, if that's what the references. If that's what you want, you need to say it. So these are all considerations for you when you're establishing minimum requirements. Whether the experience of subcontractors can be considered. I don't have the experience, but I can go and subcontract to someone that's done this lots of times. Can that count? You need to say whether it can or cannot. Whether the specific vendor personnel that worked on the reference account must be offered to work. Sort of said that before. i.e. if the vendor is going to use the experience of these personnel to satisfy the experience requirement, it has to have these personnel work under the contract. You will want to, so continuing on, you will want to reserve the right to contact references of the state's choosing, including references not provided by the vendor that you found out about through other means than the vendor, because they're only going to give you their best references. And you want to know what their best references have to say, but you also want to know what other vendors have to say. So if you have the ability to identify other potential references, you want to reserve the right to contact references of your choosing. And you're not going to want to be obligated to check every reference the vendor gives you. They give you 100 references, and you check 5, and you say, no, you're not responsible based upon these 5. They can come back and say, well, did you check the other 95? No, we didn't, because we picked the 5 that seemed like the best ones. They all said you were lousy. If we reserve the right to not check all references, merely the ones most appropriate, you should be in good standing for not doing so. And you want to have that 5-year state experience clause we've mentioned before, and specifically check with your counterparts in the state. Here's something that very few people think about. Drinking tea and blowing your nose. Isn't that nice to have a cold? All right, that's why you're all staying far away from me. To allow the maximum flexibility for vendors to meet minimum qualifications, 2 or more sets of alternative experience levels can be established. So instead of saying one size fits all, you must meet this level of experience, you can say, all right, here's 2 or 3. If you meet any one of these, this is good enough. And here's some examples. So the typical way is like what's in turquoise. Can require 3 references of $100,000 each. So that is one possible, and that is the typical way we have written it. But you can say, you can meet any of the following: 3 of 100,000, or at least 1 reference of 100,000, and at least 300,000 of other total business. So in one respect, you're actually setting a higher reference. You're requiring them, in that example, to have $400,000 of total business. And you're also requiring at least one of them to be of 100,000. Because the reality is that both aspects are important. Both the size of a particular account, but what probably is more important is how many different accounts and how much total business are you doing. If you're doing $1 million worth of business, but none of them are more than 50,000, you're still doing $1 million worth of business. And so someone that meets 3 of 100,000 might only be doing $300,000 worth of business. One actually has more experience than the other, even though it doesn't meet the minimum requirement. Or you can not require any single, or the other value is, or 500,000 of total value of references with at least 1 of 50,000. So you can see these are alternatives. And this is where Joy said vendors might, in pre-bid or through questions, might come back and say, would you change this? We have $1 million of references, but we don't have 3 of 100,000. Would you accept $1 million if our largest account is 80,000? And we can say, okay, we'll establish 500,000 with at least 1 of 50. You're still getting a vendor that obviously has lots of experience, but you have revised your specifications and so that vendor can submit without really reducing anything of significance. You should consider these things if you're going to set minimum requirements, maybe have these alternatives. The total value of the contracts being performed may be as important an indicator of capability as the value of individual references. So that's what that is supposed to illustrate. Various mix and match types of reference scenarios can be established, either as per the original solicitation requirements or as just mentioned as contingency fallback strategy if there were strong objections from vendors. Remember, any aspect of specifications, including minimum qualifications, can be protested by a potential bidder or offerer if it can be claimed that the requirement unreasonably restricts competition or unreasonably keeps them from competing for an award. And believe me, I have been in situations where in the past, I have set minimum qualifications, and the vendor asks for it to be changed, and we say, nope, that's our minimum. And the next thing I know, there's a letter to the governor, and in the letter to the governor, what it always is painted as, I'm a Maryland-based firm, I pay taxes, I employ X amount of Maryland residents, and here's the state keeping me from being able to compete for a job for business of the state. Why are you, Governor X, having an administration that allows this to happen? You ran on a basis of being business friendly, and here you have these organizations working for you that keep us from doing work. Governor, be good to your word. And those letters typically come down the line, and I've had situations where it would pass from the governor's office to, when I was at the health department, to the health department, passed down to me to answer. And okay, how do I answer now? So they're challenging my decision, and I'm supposed to answer my decision the way the governor would answer my decision, because if this is accepted, it's going to go out under the governor's name. And the one I remember most vividly was when the letter accused me of being one of these, I forget the terminology, but one of these many worthless state bureaucrats, and I should be fired. And the letter specific, because I eliminated someone as, not because of minimum requirements, but because they would not conform to a mandatory clause in the specifications. And I wouldn't do it. And so the letter went to the governor, and I think this was, it was under Schaefer, because I was here at the health department. And I got this thing sent down to me to answer, and I read it, and so I didn't know this letter had come in until I got it to answer. And here, this person by name is a worthless bureaucrat that is thwarting the governor's efforts for business development, etc. And people like him should be fired from state government. And I said, oh, no, he shouldn't. So I wrote some kind of generic answer and passed it back up the line, and my supervisor changed it. Supervisor changed it. Well, it basically turned it into a praise thing for me, and said the state was lucky to have me, and they're misguided as far as their interpretation for me to be fired. I had no choice. I had to do it. And supposedly it went out from the governor that way. But anyway, it's the first time last time I ever was specifically named in the letter to the governor that I should be fired. So I guess I'm happy that 20 years ago that didn't happen. But those things happen.
Can I get a copy of that letter in case it's ever needed?
Did they uphold your position?
Well, actually, what happened in that particular instance was then the vendor sent another letter back to the governor that said, okay, now that I see this explanation, I can understand how that individual may not have had a choice, and now that I see all the praise that has been done, maybe he shouldn't be fired. But then something else still should be changed, that it shouldn't be the situation that he doesn't have a choice. It still is a problem that you, Governor, should address.
And what was the final result? Do you remember?
Final result is actually years later that individual who had a company went to work for Maryland Public Television, and I had to deal with him. It was a public relations firm that he had that I eliminated, and then when he ended up working for public television, do you remember when? No. Well, I do.
If you can't beat him, join him? Is that the
I guess.
world?
So anyway, you have to think of this situation. If it comes to a letter, whether it's to the governor, whether it is to the secretary of your department, whether it is something that you that is sent to the Sun paper or the editor of the local paper and is decrying these state requirements, how defensible is it going to be? If it is very defensible, fine. If you're going to waver, if it's when it starts being in forms like that, you're going to say, well, I guess we really don't need that. Well, then don't have it to begin with. And all you have to do in the planning stage is figure all these things out. And again, not too much, not too little, just right. That's all you have to do, get everything right. Let's see. The most prudent response to a protest on minimum qualifications might be to uphold the protest and revise, meaning lessen the experience requirement in some fashion, such as eliminate, lower the number, the value, give this alternative, etc. Or if sealed bidding is involved, switch to sealed proposal that you can do an evaluation and don't have to have an absolute minimum. And less time and effort will be required in the procure stage in making such decisions if the contingency alternatives were agreed in planning. Just to go back to this protest. Unless a vendor protests something and actually wants like no references whatsoever, if they want anything that's reasonable, I'm going to go ahead and uphold the protest and change it rather than fight the protest, because that's going to take more time and effort, and then in many instances just agree to something that's reasonable. So that's what that's supposedly saying.
Question.
Yes?
Who determines whether it's going to be a sealed bid? Yeah, those two options, is that the procurement officer, or is that something that can be decided by the spec writer?
Well, the procurement officer is the one that is in charge of the procurement, so theoretically the procurement officer is comfortable with that. Now,
Because you're kind of convincing me that the sealed proposal is the better option to go because you have the evaluation flexibility.
except you have to look at, there's baggage that comes with sealed proposals. And the baggage is a lot more time and a lot more effort, both from a vendor standpoint and from the state personnel standpoint. And whereas in a sealed bid, you open it up, and typically the day that you open it up, unless there's an issue of responsiveness or responsibility, you can say who's going to get the award, you can make award. If it's sealed proposal, you're talking about weeks or months. And if you can't take weeks or months, you don't do sealed proposals.
The only reason why I asked that is Rick Pendleton, who was with us, we went out on a low bid. When the bidder came in to sign the contract, Rick knew that he couldn't meet the job, couldn't do the job, because he way underbid the job. And so Rick basically said, I want to see some workup of cost of materials and things like that, because we don't think you can do it. And then the guy backed out.
That's not an evaluation.
Okay.
That is making a determination of responsibility.
Agreed.
And you can do that. Are you capable of doing the work? Did you make a mistake in your bid price?
Which the fellow admitted he did and withdrew.
So those are things that you have to, you're basically supposed to do. And that does not mean you're evaluating.
Okay, I thought that would fall under the evaluation criteria, but that's determined responsibleness.
Or you do
Responsibility.
Responsibility, not responsibleness.
Two things. Number one, did you make a mistake in bid? So the first thing you're supposed to determine whether the vendor made a mistake. If it seems like they're unreasonably low, you do something that's called confirm their bid. And basically you're saying to them, we think you might have been too low. Go back and look and see if you think you made a mistake. If they come back and say, yes, I should have been $5,000 higher, and for instance, so can I change my bid price to make it $5,000 higher, that I'll still be low bid? The answer is no. Mistaken bid, the only thing a vendor's allowed to do is withdraw it, or it can be corrected if it is obvious there's a mistake and it is also obvious what the intended bid price should have been. If it's obvious there was a mistake and what the price should have been, you will correct the bid yourself. And if the vendor alleges a mistake, and it is not either obvious that a mistake was made, or it's obvious a mistake was made, but it's not obvious what the intended price should have been, the only thing they can do is withdraw it. And if they don't allege mistake, you still get to the point of, do I believe them? Do I determine them to be responsible? And if the answer is no, I don't think they can do it. I don't think they either have the capacity or the reliability or the integrity to do it for that bid price, you will find them not responsible after you talk to your assistant AG. Okay, so here's what you will require as far as references. We're still on references. And this will be in the solicitation. The name, address of the reference, who is it that you're giving as the reference? A current contact person at the reference, and you want to make that current because you don't want to contact them and find out, don't work here anymore. All right, well, does anyone know anything about this particular company? I don't know. I have the same phone number as that person. I have no idea who might know anything. Can't help you. Click. So you want a current reference who can vouch for the nature of the work performed for the organization by the vendor and the degree of satisfaction. That's what you're looking for. What they've done and the degree of satisfaction. And what you typically should ask for is the name, title, telephone number, and email address, because most times email is the most effective way to communicate. All the time, just one point. If you call them up, frequently you're going to have telephone tag. Email, you still may not get an answer, but at least you can put in a succinct question and there's more likelihood of responses. Yes?
I've had some vendors who, with their references, most have been the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, but various offices, or maybe the Department of Human Resources. So you think it's best to advise them to give you something outside of our purview as well?
All right, the question is, if for the type of work you're doing, and you say to the vendor, give you references, that the typical references they give you are for other contracts they've done either for your own state agency, maybe not your exact same unit of the agency or another state agency, should you allow that? Should you ask for non-state agencies, etc.? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on what kind of reference you're looking for. If what you're looking for is the capability of something similar to what you're doing, and the only entity that does that type of work is another state agency, then that should be fine. If what you're looking for is not necessarily specific to what government does, and you want to see some experience beyond state agencies, first of all, if you use the 5-year experience with state agencies, you're going to get the one anyway. And you can say that aside from work with state, either you specify, must give you some private sector, or maybe you can give them the alternative. Or it's hard to give a specific answer to that.
Just to give you one nuance of this, last week we sent out a denial of a protest letter to a vendor who gave a reference for an incumbent vendor who gave a reference for somebody in the contract monitor, actually, for the present contract, that they are the incumbent. And we found them not to be reasonably susceptible to win the new procurement.
Why?
Well, one of the reasons that I'm bringing up now is because of the poor results that we had from references. There were other reasons, but that was one.
But not simply because they identified the state person?
No.
Okay. Because...
It backfired on them.
One of the things you will see in the appendix to the perform class, if you take that, kind of deals with that issue of can the vendors name a state person as a reference. And I've had people that have been unaware that a vendor was going to name them as a reference, and they've been on the evaluation penny, and they say, must I now resign from the evaluation committee because I'm named as a reference? And the answer is no. First question is, does that bias you in any way because the vendor named you as a reference? No. Are you going to give them necessarily a glowing reference, especially if they say no? Or are you going to give a very biased negative reference? If there's no obvious reason why a person should be recused from a committee, then the fact they've done it is done it. Or sometimes you can say, don't use personnel of our agency as a reference. So it depends. You have to decide whether that's something you want or don't want. All right, so you ask for this information with the references. Here's other things you can do, and these are things that typically don't happen, but you're typically going to do these for more major procurements, because that's the only ones that are worth this. Require that the reference be aware of the fact it has been given as a reference. So it's one thing to name somebody, but you want to know for major references that they're aware of it, so that if they get a phone call or an email, that they'll be expecting it, because presumably they've given the vendor permission to use them. That means they'll be willing to reply to a request from the state to check the reference. Possibly even require a written certification from the reference to this effect to be included with the bid offer, possibly with the information mentioned on the next slide. So there have been times when I have required the vendor to return a letter of acknowledgement from the reference that they know they were included as a reference. And there's other times you even require the reference to come directly from the reference, that you either have them send it in separately or they have it send it in a sealed envelope to be included in the envelope that the vendor's providing, so that they can't see what the reference says, good, bad, or indifferent. So those are considerations depending on the complexity. This is most appropriate when references are important and there is no time to make multiple contacts to try to get reference responses. The information you will want confirmed is the nature of the assignment done by the vendor in terms of whether the contract objectives were satisfied, work was performed within the expected price and expected time frame, the overall satisfaction with the vendor, the level of cooperation of the vendor, if the vendor exceeded contract requirements, the assessment of personnel offered to work on the state contract who worked on the references contract. If there's a requirement for a written reference, okay, let me just changing thoughts. So these are the things you're going to want to look for, and one of the things I might say in a future slide is one of the specific questions to ask a vendor, if you're dealing with them on the phone or something like that, would you hire this vendor again? Knowing what you know now, would you hire them again? And sometimes you'll be surprised what you get. I can remember one instance we required 3 references, and from a particular vendor, 2 of the references were negative. And we said to ourselves, why would they give us vendors references that would say they didn't do a good job? Either they didn't know the vendors were going to give a negative reference, or maybe they only references they had that met the requirements, so they had to give them and hope we wouldn't check. If you require it, check it. Excuse me. If there is a requirement for a written reference confirmation as per a preceding slide, ask, all right, I said this again, if the reference would recommend the vendor and willingly use it again for any comments or information the contact wishes to provide. If a written reference confirmation is not used, ask these questions of the reference verbally. Examples of other types of minimum requirements might be for the contract activity to be performed within a specific Maryland political subdivision, if it's a requirement that they do work in that location. The bidder or offer will need to identify the location where the activity will be performed, and it must be confirmed the address is within a specific location. So that is very objectively determinable. Is it within the boundaries of Baltimore City? You know if it is or it isn't. That a type of license or certificate must be provided. That it must be licensed by the Maryland Insurance Agency. Either it is or it isn't. must be certified as a 501c corporation if there is a regulation or law that requires that only nonprofits can compete. You cannot make a requirement that only nonprofits can compete if you do not have a law or regulation that allows you to make that restriction. Otherwise, you cannot. Be certified for workplace drug testing. For instance, if it's a contract for laboratory testing, we can say you must have these certificates. Either they have them or they don't have them. If they have them, they're qualified. If they don't have them, they're not qualified. Certificate of need from the Maryland Health Care Commission. You either have it or you don't have it. Personnel. You must be a doctor. You must be a nurse. You must be a lawyer. You must be a CPA. If these are requirements, produce the evidence that you have these certifications. It comes in with the proposal, or you go afterwards and ask for it, and either they have the certification or they don't. Minimum number of covered lives for health insurance, an unqualified peer review for an auditing contract. These are things that have significance for those type of things. So, let's see, how many more slides do we have? One more slide. We'll deal with that. One more slide. Reference requirements for sealed proposal procurements. The simplest approach is to merely require offers to submit relevant references with no minimum requirements. Tell us what you have. That's the simplest thing. Tell us, explain your experience with a focus on those most relevant to the subject matter of this RFP. So you don't have to tell them 1, 2, 3, 5, duration, anything like that. You tell them to give you the references and you evaluate. And you certainly are capable, you as a procurement officer and an evaluation are capable of reading different vendors and different numbers and types of references and determining who seems to have capability based upon those references, particularly if you follow up and check with the references themselves. So without any minimums of any kind, you can make a very valid determination as to whether one vendor is capable versus another vendor. So you don't have to have any. Or the thing that you might do is simply list a preference. Tell us the references that you have that are most similar. It is preferred that at least 3 references be provided. Preferred is not a minimum mandatory limit. So it's telling them that what you're looking for, but it doesn't say if you don't have it, you're out of here. So that's another thing with sealed proposals that you can do, is list a preference, but not an absolute. So with that, you can go to lunch and come back and find about the little lost contracts.